I saw your book on the shelf at Arwak Bookstore here in Washington, D.C., and being from Guyana, I took an immediate notice of it. And the proprietor, Mr. Payne,
Yes.
he gave me a copy of the book, and I sat down and I began to read the book and never put it down.
Up next on Carib Nation Television, a nostalgic journey through Guyana with Noel Bacchus, best-selling author of the book Guyana Farewell. When America wants to know what's happening in the Caribbean diaspora, there is one clear choice.
Hello, welcome to Carib Nation.
Both people inside and outside are
Very excited about today's program.
Looking at you, I can tell that you have traveled the journey.
One television organization brings America close to the people, stories, and events that affects Caribbean life.
Bacchus, welcome to Carib Nation.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I saw your book on the shelf at Arwak Bookstore here in Washington, D.C., and being from Guyana, I took an immediate notice of it. And the proprietor, Mr.
Payne. Yes.
said, are you going to be in town to do a reading?
Yes.
If I would like to talk to you, and I said, yes, why not? He gave me a copy of the book, and I sat down and I began to read the book and never put it down.
Oh, really?
I only left Guyana 9 years ago, so
Yes.
a lot of the scenes that you paint in the book are familiar to me, but nevertheless, there was that grip.
Yes.
What prompted you to write this book?
My children were born in New York City. They've never been to Guyana. My wife is American. When they were very young, as most parents do, we used to read stories to them when they were going to bed. And as most children they want to have the same stories over and over and over. So every once in a while, I would sneak in a little story about what it was like growing up in Guyana. And they thought they were stories. They thought they were fairy tales. So when my eldest son was about 12, he said, Dad, why don't you write some of those fairy tales you used to tell us about Guyana? And I said, Sebastian, those weren't fairy tales. That was my life. And he said, more reason, Dad. So I started writing. And that's how Guyana Farewell came to be.
But you left Guyana 40 years ago. How were you able to recollect all these images, all these scenes?
What happens is that as you write, it triggers memories, and they come flooding back. I recall there's one scene in which I was thinking about my father, and then suddenly I remembered being on a train in Japan, traveling from Tokyo to Osaka, and looking at the reflection in the window. You know how when the train is going, the glass reflects?
Right.
And I suddenly saw this face, which I thought was my father's, and I was stunned. And just as quickly, I realized it was my face that I was seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was such an anguished moment. I mean, the tears started to come down because my father was dead by then. And here I was in this car on the train with only Japanese around, and tears running down. And I remembered this, and of course I put it in the book.
Right, right.
So when I wrote about the rainy season, and I remember the rain on the roof, then it was extraordinary how memories would come flooding back. And sometimes I wouldn't remember something exactly, so I would call a friend, or I'd call my sister or my brother, and I'd say, did you recall this, or did you recall that? And sometimes their recollection was quite different.
Why did you title the book Guyana Farewell? I was trying to figure that out, and I really couldn't figure it out. So
many people have asked me that. Because for me, it is a farewell in several different levels. It's a farewell to a time and a place that really doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I grew up there in the 1930s and 40s, and many of the things that existed then, the atmosphere, it was a colony, it was not an independent state. It was quite Victorian in its perspectives. There were many quaint things about Guyana that people who read the book laugh about, even I laugh about. And also, I will never return to Guyana to live. So that also, I'm 62 years old, maybe I have 10 years more. And so it was as fond a goodbye to all that. That's why I call it Guyana Farewell.
yes, interesting. Another thing that really intrigued me, and which I couldn't figure out, why did you start the book at Christmas?
I started the book at Christmas because when I sat down to write, that was the first thing that came to me.
Why? Why?
Well, the day before, I had been listening to a record, and on the record was a rendition of an old Christmas carol, which brought back to me a flood of memories about Christmas, and Christmas was one of the most wonderful times. So it was natural for me to start there. And I had the largest amount of immediate memories, and that's why I started it. And then when I had written it, the editor suggested other possibilities to start with, because I wrote it in sections. But I loved the sound of the start. I loved how it sounded, and so I said, that's what I want.
When America wants to know what's happening in the Caribbean diaspora, there is one clear choice.
Hello, welcome to Carib Nation.
Both people inside and outside are very excited about today's program.
Looking at you, I can tell that you have traveled the journey.
On any given Sunday, the Caribbean wakes up to a familiar sound. We enjoy traditional tastes. We share a friendly game, and like clockwork, we gather in a common place. And there, we hear a familiar voice.
Hello, welcome to Carib Nation.
In the book, you teased out a number of issues. The book is beautifully written,
Thank you.
simpler,
Thank you.
but full of images.
Thank you.
And it teased out a number of issues: race,
Yes?
class,
Yes.
sports,
Yes?
colonization.
Yes?
All of these wrapped up into one. I think that is what makes it such a dynamic piece of literature.
And none of this was intentional.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I wrote as I felt and remembered. And it's astounded me the response that people have had to it and the things they read into it that are a revelation to me. Not necessarily intended, but maybe subconsciously I thought about it.
You wrote very movingly about your mother and your father, but especially your mother. And for me, that was a celebration of Guyanese and Caribbean motherhood. Talk a little bit about that. What is it that went into you as you were putting down those words?
I think it would be easier if I read a small passage.
Sure, go right ahead.
Can I do that?
Yes.
My mother was a very strong woman, as you could tell.
From the book, there's no doubt about that.
And my father was a civil servant, and civil servant salaries were very low. With 6 children, it was difficult to support them, which was why my mother started making preserves, jams and jellies to sell. And some years, she made 2 or 3 times as much as my father did. So let me read a little about that. By the time I became conscious of the significance of her enterprises, my mother's work had already achieved the size of a cottage industry. She was generating hundreds of jars of guava jelly neatly packaged in screw-top glass jars and attractively identified by a colorful printed label. During the periods of my mother's greatest production, the kitchen of our home was a simmer of boiling vessels and crackling coal pots. The rhythmic thwack, thwack of wood being chopped in the bottom house was often our first waking sound. A cast iron stove, fueled with wood, and several coal pots with charcoal were lit as early as 5 a.m. and constantly replenished throughout the day. My mother would go to the market to bargain for the guavas. They would say, "Look at these guavas, missus. They're ripe and sweet. I'm going to give you a good price." To which my mother might respond, "Those too green," or "Half of them almost rotten. I'm going to pick out the best ones for your mum." You know how they used to talk. Successful, she would return home, and we would have domestic help working with her. Sweating in the heat, they would talk and sing and complain with an occasional apprehensive aside to each other. "You better stop drinking that tea and finish them bottles. Sister V gonna fix you proper." My mother's first name was Vivian, so they used to call her Sister V.
Okay.
My mother's return was similar to a small hurricane. A furiously ringing bicycle bell, everybody rode bicycles, a rattle of wooden boards on the bridge, a clatter of a 2 loose bicycle chain, was followed by her peremptory call from downstairs, summoning the nearest person to assist her in unloading her cargo. "Ada? Ivy? One of you come quick." Woe to those passers-by in front of our house, caught in the wake of her urgent requirements. "You fella, yes, you, come here and help me." That was my mother. If you were around and she needed help, she would summon you.
You obviously was very close to your mother.
Yes.
But your father, I sense there was a sort of distance.
Yes.
Why?
Well, it has to do with the time. Growing up in Guyana was a Victorian affair. By that, everybody was very strict. It was authoritarian. There was not a lot of show of emotion. This, I'm talking about a middle class.
Right.
And I suspect that was an emulation of the British, because, you know, everything was patterned on the British.
And then he was a civil servant too, so, you know, authority.
So there was a reserve to him. I think that was also a natural reserve. And although my mother was the dominant person in the family, my father was the authority.
Silent, but authoritative.
Yes, everybody deferred to him. And so even though he seemed mild-mannered, we knew that he was the authority. So it was not easy to except when you were very small, to get a hug or a kiss.
Right.
As you
right.
got older, the reserve was more.
Your father was East Indian.
Yes.
And your mother was mixed.
My mother was mixed. She was the great-great-grandchild of a Barbadian slave.
Okay.
And that Barbadian slave, one of the men she had children was my great-grandfather, and then my grandfather, and she was what they would call a high yellow slave.
Okay.
And she married a very dark man, and so that's how the blend. My grandfather married a Trinidadian woman who was the daughter of a Jewish accountant. So there's a whole mixture there.
Mix up.
Yes.
But your mother would have been categorized as mixed.
Yes,
or
that's
near
right.
black.
Definitely.
And she was married to an Indian.
Yes.
Not a very fashionable thing in Guyana in those days.
That is quite right.
How did that impact on your household?
Well, this is hearsay, but my father and mother met working as the lowest clerks in the civil service at the law courts.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, as young people do, they got attracted to each other. But because he was Indian, his parents objected strenuously. My grandparents, when they learned that his parents were objecting, they in turn then objected.
Typical.
Well, as young people do, when they could, they got away and met each other. Finally, both sets of parents acknowledged that this was going to happen. So they had a chaperone. My uncle was their chaperone. And eventually they got married. But it was, in those days, it was unusual, but now it isn't as much.
Mm-hmm. So when you were growing up, you were what called a dogla? Or,
yes, that was one of the things we were called.
Mm-hmm.
My father's family lived in the country in Mahaica, and they would come to visit occasionally, and that gave me some introduction to Indian life.
Okay.
But our life generally was dominated by my grandparents on my mother's side, who lived up the street from us, and were, I suppose, a middle class, very proper.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were more influenced by them than by Indian side.
When America wants to know what's happening in the Caribbean diaspora, there is one clear choice.
Hello, welcome to Carib Nation.
Both people inside and outside are very excited about today's program.
Looking at you, I can tell that you have traveled the journey.
On any given Sunday, the Caribbean wakes up to a familiar sound. We enjoy traditional tastes. We share a friendly game, and like clockwork, we gather in a common place. And there, we hear a familiar voice.
Hello, welcome to Carib Nation.
You talked a lot about sports in the book. And,
Yes.
sports was certainly part of your
Yes.
growing up, you and your brothers
Very much.
and your sister,
Very
in
much.
particular cricket.
Yes.
And you
Oh, I loved it.
recounted some scenes
Oh, I loved
of
it.
cricket
Oh,
and so forth.
Yes.
Was cricket in particular and sports in general part of the education growing up
Cricket-
here in colonial Guyana?
Cricket was the essence of sport in Guyana and the West Indies. We lived about 2 blocks away from the Guyana Cricket Club. It was called B.A.there. And that's where the international matches, when British or Australian or Pakistan teams came to Guyana to play at West Indies, they would play at B.A.there. And of course, everybody listened to the broadcasts on the radio, or if you didn't have a ticket or you couldn't afford a ticket. I remember as a boy trying to climb the trees overlooking the fence and being caught by my grandfather and getting a whipping and listening to the announcers on the radio, and because all the windows were open in the houses because of the heat and all the radios were on, you could go along the street and follow the cricket broadcast. Try to imagine with the baseball series going along, walking along the street, you couldn't hear a thing.
No.
But because all the houses, the windows were open, you would hear the voices of the announcer, and he runs up to deliver the ball, and he makes a wonderful square cut, and you'd hear the cheering. Oh, it was wonderful.
Who was your favorite cricketer?
Oh, Frank Worrell.
Grace.
Grace, the elegance, how he would move down and square cut the ball. It was just extraordinary.
Do you yearn for those days today? I mean, now we get cricket on the television and so forth, but still it's not a real thing.
There is a strong nostalgia that comes on me every once in a while for that pastime. I remember my friends would come by and my mother would have packed a hamper with sandwiches cut, the sandwiches, the bread would be cut in squares and the crust would be taken off and it would be wrapped in napkins, and you would take it to the cricket and you would open this hamper with the napkins, cloth napkins, and you eat the sandwiches and watch the cricket and drink tea. It was a distant time. It was wonderful, but that was the past. My boys who were American and growing up here often say to me, "Dad, you were kind of weird, aren't you?" They're just teasing me.
Your family traveled a lot. You traveled from Georgetown as far as Skeldon.
Oh, yes.
Guyanese, even today,
Yes.
they will have to become adults before they will travel from Georgetown to Skeldon.
Yes.
And obviously you traveled a lot. And so you got a sense to take in the scenery in Guyana.
Yes.
And obviously that impressed you tremendously because throughout the book you interject. And you mentioned names of villages. Tell us a little bit about how that shaped your own sense of being.
My mother was very religious, and she belonged to a church, and they had churches all over the country, small churches, and we had friends in Skeldon, which is on the Quarantine River.
Right on the border with Suriname.
And in August, she would take us for 2 weeks to stay with a friend, and it was a long trip because in those days there was still a train, and it was a little train on a narrow gauge track with black smoke on it. And it would go along and stop at all these little villages all along the way, and people would come to the windows and you'd lean out the windows and they'd be selling you fruits and vegetables and Indian things like palauri and patties and so on. And then after traveling maybe half the day, and the train rocketing along, and you'd look out through the windows and you'd see the cane fields spread out green and creeks, and you'd see men pushing bullocks, pulling the cane or cutting the cane, and you would smell, the smoke from the train, and the train would oh, it was wonderful. And then we'd come to the ferry, and you'd get off the train and you'd get on this ferry and you would go across the ferry, and the next morning we would take the bus, and the bus would have all these baggage piled on top of these wooden buses, with slats for the seats, and these women would bring their chickens and their market baskets and they would pile them into the train, and we'd set off on this road and heading for Skeldon. Oh, it was wonderful.
You've been away from Guyana 40 years, 41 years to be precise, because you left in 1955.
Right.
It's 2/3 of your life outside of Guyana.
That's right.
Yet you write these beautiful things, and you remember Guyana with a certain kind of fondness.
Yes.
But you said just now that you wouldn't go back.
I did say I wouldn't go back. I said it's unlikely that I'll go back because at 62, with 2 boys, one in graduate school and one in college, and all the concerns, and probably grandchildren coming, and a business to run, it's difficult to do it.
It's difficult.
Yes.
But
and I think also I'm afraid that when I get back, it will be so different that it will distress me.
Yes.
And it probably isn't. I'm sure the rhythms are the same. I'm sure many of the things I portray are the same. But you like to hold on to a picture.
Right, right.
And I think that more than anything else is what...
Your motivation to write this book, that is your kids,
Yes.
is very important
Yes.
because there are old generations of Caribbean
Yes.
children being
Yes.
born here in
Yes,
the diaspora
absolutely.
and who are hungry
Yes.
for an understanding, a cultural connection
Yes.
with the Caribbean, with Guyana.
Yes.
And I think that's the function of this book.
One of the loveliest things that has happened as a result of this book, because remember, I had a very narrow focus. I was writing it specifically for my sons.
Right.
But it's been extraordinary. I get letters from young people, old people. I got a letter from a man who left Guyana in 1934 and said in his letter, I left Guyana when the year you were born. And it just brings back the most wonderful memories. A young lady, she must be 25, stopped me on the street and said, are you Noel Bacchus who wrote Guyana Farewell? And I said, yes. She said, you know, I've never been to Guyana, but my parents were there. And you made me feel as if I was there.
Mm-hmm.
So I was stunned.
Sense of satisfaction.
And I was just stunned.
You were. Do you plan to do part 2?
I doubt it. This was hard work. This was very hard work.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. People have asked me that, and it was hard work.
I know. Any parting words you want to tell the audience?
If you, whoever you are, listening here, Guyanese, Caribbean, or anyone others, try to remember things about your childhood and write them down for your children. It would be a wonderful legacy for them. Write it down. You too.
Yeah,
Write it down.
I most certainly will. The book is Guyana Farewell, written by Noel Bacchus. It's a book that I recommend very highly to all Guyanese, all Caribbean people, because it's a book that takes you into the bowels of Guyana, the bowels of our Caribbean existence. And it's interesting that it's written by someone who has been here for over 40 years.
Yes.
So it gives a perspective that many of us can identify with.
Yes.
You know, because Caribbean people come here and we always intend to go back home.
Right.
We always intend to go back home and we never make it back. But with the old new globalization and the information highway and so on, the world becomes a smaller place.
Yes.
And when we read books like this, then we can reconnect with our childhood, reconnect with our culture, and really understand who we are. This book goes a long way towards dealing with the old question of our identity as a people.